In Evelyn Carter's eyes, the new driver was simply a quiet man who opened car doors and disappeared behind a steering wheel. He rarely spoke, never complained, and seemed content with a life of small, forgettable tasks. But on a certain night, in an empty underground parking garage, 4 strangers blocked her path with violent intentions. Evelyn believed she had run out of options, until her driver, Lucas Reed, stepped out of the shadows. He did not shout, he did not panic. He moved like a ghost through darkness. And within seconds, everything she had ever believed about him collapsed. If hidden secrets that quietly overturn an entire destiny intrigue you, stay with this story until its very final word. Evelyn Carter ran one of the most respected security technology companies in Chicago, a firm her father had built from a single locked filing cabinet into a corporation worth billions of dollars. The company's headquarters rose above the river in a tower of dark glass, a building that seemed to mirror the careful, guarded way Evelyn had learned to move through the world. From her corner office on the top floor, she could watch the entire city below her, a vantage point she had earned through relentless discipline rather than inherited privilege alone. She was known across the industry for being brilliant, decisive, and almost impossible to fool, the kind of executive who memorized contracts before her lawyers had even finished reading them. Trust, for Evelyn, was a currency she rarely spent, and she preferred to keep most people at arm's length, including the staff who orbited her daily life without ever truly entering it. Colleagues admired her, competitors feared her, and almost nobody claimed to know her beyond the surface she allowed the world to see. When her longtime driver resigned without warning, citing a sudden family emergency that nobody bothered to question too closely, the agency sent a replacement named Lucas Reed within a matter of days. He was 39, broad-shouldered but unremarkable in the way he carried himself, with a calm face that gave away absolutely nothing about the life he had lived before arriving at her door. His resume listed a short string of ordinary jobs, nothing that hinted at the years buried beneath them, and the agency had vouched for him without asking the kinds of questions that might have uncovered the truth. Evelyn looked him over for exactly 4 seconds before deciding he was harmless, a man with limited ambition who would spend his days driving in silence and his nights forgetting her name entirely. She had seen dozens of drivers come and go over the years, each one blending quietly into the background of her schedule, and she assumed Lucas would be no different from any of them, just another face she would forget the moment he left her employment. He arrived early every morning, always before she expected him, and he walked the perimeter of the garage before opening her door, checking mirrors, checking shadows, checking exits that nobody else seemed to notice even existed. Evelyn assumed this was simply an odd habit, perhaps something left over from a previous job at a car dealership or a rental company that had trained its employees too thoroughly. She never once asked him about his past, considering it irrelevant to a man whose only function, in her mind, was to deliver her safely from one meeting to the next. Mason Blake, the company's polished and well-liked chief financial officer, noticed Lucas far more carefully than Evelyn did, and something about the driver's constant presence near her office unsettled him in ways he kept hidden behind a courteous smile. Mason had spent years cultivating an image of effortless competence, the trusted right hand who never raised his voice and never missed a detail, and the arrival of a stranger he could not quite read threatened the careful order he had built around himself. Mason had built years of charm and apparent loyalty around Evelyn, and he disliked anyone who lingered too close to her schedule, especially someone whose history seemed conveniently thin. That particular week was preparing to finalize a merger worth several $billions, a deal that would place her company's security software inside government contracts across multiple countries and cement her legacy for decades to come. The pressure made her sharper and colder than usual, and she barely registered the fragments of conversation that drifted past her on the way to meetings, her mind occupied entirely by clauses, projections, and the weight of her father's name. Lucas, however, registered everything, training that had once kept soldiers alive now quietly cataloging the smallest details of corporate life. He overheard pieces of phone calls in stairwells, noticed visitors who arrived without proper credentials, and clocked the exact moment certain employees stopped making eye contact with him whenever he passed. He said nothing because suspicion without proof was worthless, and he had learned the hard way that accusations made too early only warned the guilty and gave them time to vanish. On the drive home one evening, through the tinted glass of the rearview mirror, Lucas watched a black sport utility vehicle trail Evelyn's car through 3 consecutive turns, never closing the distance, never falling back, simply waiting, patient in a way that ordinary traffic never was. In the days that followed, Lucas quietly began altering the route home, taking longer paths through better-lit streets, avoiding the narrow service roads the previous driver had always used without thinking twice. He varied departure times by a few minutes here and there, small adjustments that meant nothing to Evelyn but everything to anyone trying to predict her movements. Evelyn noticed the change in time before she noticed the reason, and it irritated her immediately, because she disliked anything that deviated from a pattern she controlled down to the minute. She confronted him directly in front of Mason, her voice clipped and final, reminding Lucas that his job was to drive, not to make decisions about her safety or her schedule. Lucas absorbed the rebuke without flinching, offering only a short apology before returning to silence, his expression betraying nothing of what he already suspected was coming. Mason watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction and later sent a brief message to a contact named Jackson Pierce, confirming that Evelyn still suspected nothing of what was unfolding around her. Around that same time, Evelyn received an anonymous email laced with vague threats about her upcoming merger, which she dismissed as standard corporate intimidation, the kind rival firms used to rattle nerves before a major deal closed. While Evelyn buried herself in contracts late into the night, Lucas noticed something far more specific. A section of the parking garage where the security cameras had developed a blind spot that had not existed the week before. He reported it to the head of building security, a man who barely looked up from his monitors before waving him off, since drivers held no real authority in that particular hierarchy of importance. Evelyn, passing through the garage one afternoon, saw Lucas lingering near a concrete pillar for longer than seemed necessary and assumed, with quiet contempt, that he was simply avoiding work like the lazy hire she had begun to suspect he was. She made a mental note to mention his apparent laziness to the agency that had placed him, irritated that she even had to think about someone so beneath her daily concerns. That night, after she had gone inside her building, Lucas crouched beneath her car for several long minutes, his flashlight angled carefully against the undercarriage, before his fingers closed around a small tracking device hidden against the chassis where no casual glance would ever find it. The following morning brought a board meeting that tested every ounce of composure Evelyn possessed, as several board members challenged the merger's structure and the risks tied to expanding into volatile markets overseas. Voices rose around the long table, numbers and projections thrown back and forth like weapons, and Evelyn fought to keep her tone level even as frustration tightened behind her eyes. Mason, sensing an opening, mentioned almost casually that Evelyn's new driver had an unusually thin employment history, a remark dressed as concern but aimed like a blade meant to wound quietly. One older board member laughed and suggested that a woman running a security firm should perhaps hire personnel with more polished resumes, a jab that drew a few quiet chuckles around the table at Evelyn's expense. Evelyn, exhausted and unwilling to defend a man she barely knew, simply replied that Lucas was temporary staff and nothing more, a sentence she would later regret with a sharpness she could not yet name. Lucas, waiting outside the glass doors, heard every word through the thin gap left by the closing door, and his expression did not change at all, though something behind his calm eyes settled into quiet resolve. He had been called worse things by worse people in rooms far more dangerous than this one, and the words themselves did not wound him so much as the quiet realization that Evelyn had chosen the easier path rather than the truthful one. Later, inside the elevator, Evelyn studied him with open irritation and asked why he always seemed to be watching the room as though expecting an attack from every corner of it. Lucas answered quietly that certain dangers never bothered knocking on the front door, a sentence that struck her as needlessly dramatic for a man whose only responsibility was steering a car through traffic. She told him, not unkindly but firmly, that he was overthinking his role, and he simply nodded, choosing not to mention the tracking device now sitting in his jacket pocket, since her mood left no room for warnings tonight. The elevator hummed faintly around them, the silence stretching uncomfortably between two people who understood almost nothing about each other yet. As the numbers ticked past in dull amber light, Lucas felt the familiar tightening at the base of his neck that had once preceded every dangerous mission of his former life, a sensation he had not felt this strongly in years. He shifted his stance without announcement, angling his body slightly forward, eyes already scanning the seam where the doors would soon part. When the doors finally opened onto the dim concrete level below, Lucas stepped half a pace ahead of Evelyn before she had even noticed the silence waiting for them in the dark. The garage that evening felt wrong in ways too subtle for an ordinary person to name, though Lucas cataloged each discrepancy within seconds of stepping off the elevator. An entire row of overhead lights had gone dark, leaving long stretches of shadow between the support columns, and the low hum of the ventilation system, usually constant, had gone completely silent for reasons no maintenance schedule could explain. The air felt heavier somehow, charged with the kind of stillness that always preceded violence in places he had once worked. Evelyn's car sat near a cluster of thick concrete pillars, precisely the area where the cameras had developed their convenient blind spot days earlier, a detail Lucas had not forgotten. There were no security guards making their usual rounds, no other vehicles idling nearby, nothing but stillness pressing in from every direction like a held breath. Evelyn, focused on getting home after an exhausting day, walked quickly toward the car without registering any of it, her mind still tangled in board members and merger clauses. Lucas, several steps ahead, felt every instinct from his old life surface at once, sharp and immediate, the way a blade remembers its edge even after years spent forgotten in a drawer. 4 men emerged almost simultaneously from behind the pillars, moving with the practiced calm of people who had rehearsed this exact moment many times before. Jackson Pierce stepped forward first, broad and confident, telling Evelyn in an almost gentle tone that if she cooperated quietly, nobody needed to get hurt tonight. Evelyn felt her pulse slam against her ribs, yet decades of boardroom composure kept her spine straight and her voice level, even as her mind screamed for an exit that did not seem to exist anywhere around her. Lucas set the car keys down on the concrete without urgency, his movements unhurried in a way that seemed almost careless to anyone unfamiliar with what was about to happen, then told Evelyn, in a voice she had never heard from him before, low and unshaken, to stay directly behind him. Something in that tone made her obey instantly, without question, without the usual instinct to assert control over a situation she did not understand. For the first time since she had known him, Evelyn realized she had no idea what Lucas was capable of, and the not knowing terrified her almost as much as the men closing in around them. One of the men lunged first, and Lucas shifted his weight only slightly, redirecting the man's momentum and folding his arm at an angle that dropped him to the ground almost silently, like furniture being moved rather than a person being struck. A second attacker drew a short blade, slashing forward in a motion meant to end the confrontation quickly, but Lucas used the loose fabric of his jacket to obscure the angle of the strike before driving his palm into the man's wrist, sending the blade clattering across the concrete floor. Evelyn stood frozen, watching a man she had dismissed as ordinary move with a precision that seemed almost inhuman, each motion economical, deliberate, devastating in its quiet efficiency. There was no wasted effort in anything he did, no hesitation, no fear visible anywhere in his expression, only a terrible calm that frightened her more than the attackers themselves. Jackson, watching his men fall one after another within seconds of each other, felt the first genuine flicker of alarm cross his face, a recognition dawning slowly behind his eyes. He took a half-step backward, studying Lucas more closely, searching old memories and old warnings for a face that matched this impossible competence. When recognition finally settled, Jackson's voice dropped into something between disbelief and dread as he uttered a single word into the tense, echoing silence of the garage. Ghost. Evelyn's entire body went rigid at the sound of that name, though she had no understanding yet of its weight or what it had once meant in rooms far from her own. Lucas did not deny it, did not flinch, only told Jackson flatly that he had chosen the wrong parking garage for whatever this was meant to accomplish tonight. Jackson, recovering some of his composure, revealed that he had once heard stories about a specialist who vanished after a failed operation overseas, a name spoken only in hushed warnings among certain dangerous circles that valued silence above almost everything else. Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her understanding of the past several months, realizing that the unremarkable man who opened her car door every morning had once been something closer to a legend in rooms she would never be allowed to enter. The remaining 2 men attempted to seize Evelyn directly, hoping to force Lucas into surrender by threatening her instead of fighting him outright. Lucas used the darkness, the angles of the concrete pillars, and the sudden blare of a car alarm he triggered remotely to disorient them entirely, turning the garage itself into a weapon against them. He neutralized both men with brutal efficiency, yet without lethal force, each strike measured precisely enough to disable without destroying anyone permanently. Evelyn watched the terrifying control in his eyes, the absence of panic, the complete absence of cruelty despite the violence unfolding around her in the dark. Jackson, recognizing the fight was lost, retreated toward the exit ramp, but not before shouting back into the shadows that tonight was merely the beginning of something larger still to come. Lucas did not chase him, choosing instead to guide Evelyn quickly toward her car, scanning every corner twice before allowing her to move from where she stood. He locked the doors the moment they were inside and pulled away through a service exit most employees did not even know existed, tires whispering against concrete instead of screeching. Evelyn, voice trembling for the first time in years, finally asked him directly who he truly was, and Lucas answered only that she was not safe yet. Not tonight, perhaps not for several more nights to come. Lucas refused to drive toward her penthouse, certain that whoever orchestrated tonight's ambush already knew every detail of her residence, her schedule, and her habits down to the smallest particular. Evelyn argued furiously, unaccustomed to anyone making decisions about her life without her permission, her voice rising with a frustration that masked deeper fear underneath it. Lucas explained, with the patience of someone used to delivering difficult truths to people who did not want to hear them, that the attackers had known the exact timing of her departure, the precise blind spot in the cameras, and the specific layout of the garage, information that could only have come from inside her own company. Evelyn's thoughts immediately drifted toward Mason, though she resisted the idea with the stubbornness of someone unwilling to believe in betrayal from a man she had trusted for years and considered almost family. Lucas navigated through a series of deliberately confusing streets, doubling back twice, watching mirrors with an intensity that made Evelyn realize just how thoroughly trained he truly was beneath the quiet exterior. Eventually they arrived at a modest apartment building, plain and unremarkable, the kind of place nobody would ever associate with wealth or danger, or the man who had just dismantled 4 armed attackers without breaking a sweat. Rain had begun to fall lightly against the windshield somewhere along the final stretch of road, blurring the streetlights into long smears of gold, and for a moment neither of them spoke at all, simply listening to the soft rhythm of it against the glass. Inside, the apartment was sparse, almost monastic, containing little beyond the essentials and nothing that hinted at personal history or attachment to anything at all. Evelyn studied the bare walls and empty shelves, beginning to understand that Lucas had spent years deliberately erasing himself from the world, leaving behind no trace that could ever be traced back to him. He examined a shallow cut on her arm with surprising gentleness, his hands steady despite the violence he had unleashed only minutes earlier in the garage below. The contrast unsettled her more than the fight itself, the way a man capable of such precision and danger could also move with such careful tenderness toward a wound that barely needed attention. As she sat quietly on a worn couch trying to steady her breathing, her eyes drifted toward a small frame mounted on the wall near the window, half hidden by shadow. It held a photograph turned face down, deliberately hidden, as though even Lucas could not bear to look at whatever memory lived behind the glass, and Evelyn found herself wondering what it might cost him to ever turn it upright again. She did not ask about it that night, sensing instinctively that some doors needed to open on their own rather than be forced, and instead simply sat with the silence that filled the small apartment around them both. Evelyn demanded the truth, no longer willing to accept silence as an answer after everything she had witnessed within the span of a single terrifying hour. Lucas spoke carefully, choosing only the pieces of his past he believed necessary, explaining that he had once belonged to a covert unit specializing in hostage extraction and high-risk rescues conducted far from any public attention. The nickname Ghost had been earned through his unusual ability to infiltrate heavily guarded locations without ever being detected until it was too late for anyone to stop him from completing his objective. His final mission, however, had ended in disaster when someone within his own chain of command sold critical information to the opposing side for reasons he still did not fully understand. A close friend and fellow operative died because of that betrayal, a death Lucas still carried with him in ways that rarely surfaced but never fully healed either. Unable to prove his innocence quickly enough, he was quietly removed from the unit and erased from official record, his name folded into silence as though he had never existed at all. Since then, he had drifted between ordinary jobs, deliberately choosing roles that kept him invisible, believing that anonymity was the only protection left available to a man with his particular history. He had learned to live small on purpose, renting modest apartments under careful names, avoiding friendships that might ask too many questions, and treating every new job as simply another shadow to disappear inside. Evelyn began to understand that Lucas was not simply harmless, but rather someone who had spent years constructing harmlessness as a careful disguise against a world he no longer trusted. Lucas admitted that he had taken the driving position because he discovered her company's security software had once been connected indirectly to the very operation that ended his career and killed his friend overseas. Evelyn felt a cold wave of betrayal wash through her, certain now that his presence beside her had never been accidental at all, but rather calculated from the very beginning. Lucas did not deny the accusation, admitting that his original intention had been investigation rather than protection, a search for answers rather than a desire to guard anyone. But somewhere in those quiet months of driving her to meetings and watching her exhaustion build night after night behind a mask of relentless control, he had come to realize that Evelyn herself was being used by forces she did not even know existed around her. He reached into his jacket and placed the small tracking device on the table between them, the same one he had pulled from beneath her car days earlier, evidence that her every movement had already been monitored long before tonight's ambush ever began. Evelyn opened her secure laptop with shaking hands, determined to find proof rather than rely on instinct alone for something this serious. Lucas guided her through unfamiliar layers of the company's internal network, showing her how to trace login patterns and unusual data transfers that ordinary employees would never think to examine on their own. Together they discovered that Mason had been quietly exporting Evelyn's complete schedule, travel patterns, and security protocols for several consecutive weeks, routed through servers designed to disguise their true destination from anyone who might come looking. Worse, Mason appeared to have forged digital authorization codes attempting to transfer partial knowledge of the company's security software to an external account hidden behind layers of shell corporations. Evelyn felt something inside her crack apart, the particular pain of discovering betrayal from someone she had trusted implicitly for years and defended without hesitation. Lucas warned her gently that Mason would not stop until he obtained the final authentication key, a credential only Evelyn herself could provide through her own biometric signature. He explained that men like Mason rarely acted alone, that whoever stood behind him would already have a contingency ready the moment the first plan failed, and that they needed to move with patience rather than fear. Evelyn wanted to call the police immediately, her instinct to restore order overwhelming every other consideration running through her exhausted mind. Lucas cautioned her that corrupted officials might already be embedded somewhere within local law enforcement, given how precisely tonight's attack had been planned, and that acting too quickly could destroy their only advantage before they even understood the full scope of the threat. Clean evidence, he explained, mattered more than speed, especially against people skilled enough to erase their own tracks within hours. Evelyn, still trembling but regaining some of her old sharpness, agreed to wait and build a careful trap instead of reacting in panic that might warn the very people they needed to expose. Together they devised a plan to expose Mason openly during the signing ceremony scheduled for the following morning, when he would have no choice but to act in front of witnesses he could not silence. Late that night, as if confirming every suspicion they had gathered, Mason sent Evelyn a message dripping with false concern, asking where she was and whether she was safe, each word a lie wrapped carefully in kindness. By morning, Evelyn returned to Carter's security exactly as planned, walking through the lobby with the same composed authority she always carried, betraying nothing of the previous night's terror to anyone watching her pass. Lucas resumed his role as the quiet, forgettable driver, wearing the same worn jacket, opening her door with the same downward glance he always used to disappear into the background of her busy world. Mason exhaled visibly when he saw her, relief washing across his face at the sight of an executive who appeared completely unaware of his betrayal, his shoulders loosening for the first time in days. Evelyn performed her usual cold efficiency throughout the morning, burying every ounce of fear beneath layers of practiced control she had spent decades perfecting. Lucas, positioned near the elevators, studied the building's unfamiliar faces through reflections in polished glass, noticing two new security guards whose posture did not match anyone trained through proper channels he recognized. Inside the executive boardroom, Mason pressed Evelyn towards signing documents that would transfer critical access to the company's security infrastructure under the guise of routine merger procedures designed to look entirely ordinary. Evelyn stalled deliberately, raising minor legal questions designed to buy time without revealing suspicion, her tone measured and unhurried despite the tension coiling tightly beneath her composure. Lucas quietly transmitted encrypted evidence to Evelyn's personal attorney through a secure channel he had prepared earlier that morning, working without drawing a single glance from anyone in the room. Jackson arrived inside the building disguised as an external technician, his identification badge forged convincingly enough to pass through the lobby checkpoint without incident or question from the guards on duty. Lucas recognized him instantly despite the disguise, understanding immediately that the true plan involved forcing Evelyn down into the server room, where her biometric authorization could unlock everything Mason and Jackson needed to complete their theft. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. Today was never meant to end with a signature, but with a kidnapping disguised carefully as routine business conducted in broad daylight. Lucas felt the old, familiar calm settle over him, the same stillness that had once carried him through doorways no one else dared to enter, and he understood that whatever happened next, he would not let Evelyn walk into that server room alone. Just as Lucas moved to alert security through a private channel, the lights across the entire executive floor flickered once and went completely dark, plunging the offices into sudden, disorienting chaos. Confusion rippled through the executive floor as employees scrambled in the darkness, uncertain whether the failure was accidental or something far more deliberate than a simple power outage. Mason seized the opportunity immediately, dropping his polished mask entirely and ordering Jackson to move Evelyn toward the server room without further delay or hesitation. Evelyn fought to maintain composure even as rough hands gripped her arm, refusing to let panic overtake her despite the rising terror clawing steadily at her chest. Meanwhile, two disguised guards blocked Lucas near the stairwell, confident that an ordinary driver posed no real threat against trained muscle backed by weapons and numbers. Their confidence proved disastrously misplaced within seconds of the confrontation beginning. Lucas loosened his tie with unhurried precision, checked his watch as though timing something far more important than the chaos around him, and then began to move with the quiet certainty of a man who had done this exact thing many times before. He used the darkened hallway, the reflective surfaces of glass partitions, and the disorienting echo of a distant elevator chime to approach each guard from angles they never anticipated or trained against. Employees who caught fleeting glimpses later described only a shape sliding between shadows, there one moment and gone the next, as though the darkness itself had learned to fight on his behalf. Jackson, dragging Evelyn toward the server room, felt true fear settle into his chest for the first time that night, finally understanding that Ghost had stopped running and started hunting instead of hiding. Lucas intercepted them just outside the server room doors, moving with such controlled violence that the second guard collapsed before fully registering what had happened to him. Evelyn, finally free from Jackson's grip for a brief moment, found herself trusting Lucas completely, following his rapid instructions without a single moment of hesitation or doubt clouding her judgment. Together they moved with surprising coordination, Evelyn securing the internal systems from within while Lucas held the corridor like a wall. Nothing could pass through unchallenged. For the first time since this nightmare began, Evelyn felt something close to certainty settle over her, not because the danger had passed, but because she finally understood exactly who stood beside her in the middle of it. Jackson, cornered and desperate, drew a pistol and aimed it directly at Evelyn, knowing it was the only leverage capable of stopping Lucas entirely in his tracks. Lucas froze instantly, every instinct screaming to act, yet forced to step fully into the light, exposing himself completely for the first time that night without any shadow left to hide within. Jackson's voice cracked with barely controlled fury as he revealed that Mason had only ever been a minor piece in something far larger and far older than either of them understood. The company's security data, he explained, had once been sold years earlier to the same network of traders responsible for the failed mission that destroyed Lucas's old unit and killed his closest friend in the field. Evelyn felt the floor seem to tilt beneath her, horrified by the possibility that her father's company had unknowingly fueled the very tragedy that shaped the man now standing between her and a bullet meant for her. For a moment she thought of her sister Hannah, far away and unaware of any of this, and the thought steadied her more than she expected, reminding her there were still people worth surviving for. Lucas absorbed the revelation with quiet devastation, yet refused to let grief slow the steadiness of his hands or the sharpness of his focus on the threat in front of him. Jackson admitted his true ambition was never loyalty to Mason, but rather control of the security software itself, intended for sale to criminal networks operating far beyond national borders and beyond the reach of ordinary law. Mason, watching events spiral beyond his control entirely, realized too late that he had become expendable to a man far more dangerous and far less predictable than himself. Evelyn, recovering her nerve despite the gun still pointed in her direction, activated a hidden recording device built into her phone, capturing every word of Jackson's confession in real time for later use. Unbeknownst to either Mason or Jackson, federal authorities and Evelyn's attorney, alerted earlier that morning by Lucas, were already moving rapidly toward the building with practiced urgency. Jackson, sensing the trap closing around him from every direction at once, raised his weapon to fire, only for Lucas to trigger an emergency strobe light that blinded him in a sudden wash of harsh white. Lucas closed the distance in an instant, disarming Jackson and bringing him down hard against the floor, though not before a stray motion left a deep wound carved across his own shoulder. Evelyn rushed forward without hesitation, pressing her hands against the wound, no longer seeing a driver, a stranger, or even a legend, but simply a man bleeding because he had chosen to protect her without condition or hesitation of any kind. Lucas managed a faint, tired smile despite the pain radiating through his shoulder, murmuring something about finally finishing what he had started months earlier without fully meaning to. Evelyn called his name with a desperation that startled even herself, gripping his hand as though refusing to let exhaustion and blood loss claim him completely in front of her. The world around them blurred into distant shouting, hurried footsteps, and the eventual arrival of federal agents storming the floor with practiced, overwhelming urgency. Lucas's vision narrowed, the noise softening into something distant and muffled. Yet the sound of Evelyn's voice remained sharp and clear, even as darkness pulled steadily at the edges of his awareness. The last thing he registered before losing consciousness was her hand tightening around his, refusing, with quiet ferocity, to let go of him for even a second. In the weeks that followed, Mason was formally arrested on charges of corporate betrayal, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping, his polished reputation collapsing entirely under the weight of recovered evidence presented in court. Jackson was taken into federal custody as well, and the investigation that followed reopened the long-buried file connected to the failed overseas mission that had once destroyed Lucas's career and reputation. Slowly, methodically, the truth emerged, clearing Lucas of the blame that had haunted him for years and finally exposing the real traitor who had sold information to the opposing side long ago. Reporters who had once printed nothing about a quiet, disgraced soldier now wrote instead about a man who had walked into gunfire twice to protect a stranger who later became someone far less easy to define. Evelyn visited him often during his recovery, sitting quietly beside his hospital bed long after visiting hours technically ended, unwilling to leave him alone with only silence for company. She brought coffee neither of them really wanted and reports neither of them really needed, simply because sitting in that small room felt better than returning to an empty penthouse that suddenly seemed far too large. She apologized for the months she had spent underestimating him, admitting that she had mistaken his silence for weakness rather than recognizing it as discipline born from years of difficult experience. Lucas, ever measured, told her he had been equally at fault, approaching her at first with suspicion rather than honesty, treating her as a piece of an investigation rather than a person worth knowing. Evelyn confessed that she had spent her entire adult life building walls of power and control, convinced that strength meant trusting no one beyond herself and her own carefully managed instincts. Yet it had taken almost losing everything to realize that the one person who had truly protected her was someone she had nearly dismissed without a second thought or a moment of real consideration. Lucas admitted that he no longer wished to return to a life defined by hidden missions and constant disappearance, nor did he want to remain a ghost forever drifting unseen through other people's lives without ever truly belonging anywhere. Evelyn offered him a new role within the company, not as a driver, not as hired protection, but as a security consultant working beside her as an equal partner in decisions that actually mattered. She told him, with rare vulnerability, that she did not want him to disappear again the way he had spent so many years disappearing from everything and everyone around him. Lucas considered the offer carefully, saying nothing immediately, weighing the strange comfort of being seen clearly for the first time in years against the old instinct to simply disappear again. Evelyn, without waiting for an answer, reached forward and placed his old car keys gently back into his open palm, though this time the gesture carried no command, only quiet, genuine respect between equals. Several months later, Carter Security had rebuilt its internal systems from the ground up, closing every vulnerability that had once allowed betrayal to slip through unnoticed for so long. Evelyn emerged from the ordeal as a different kind of leader, one who listened more carefully and judged people less by title and more by character and quiet competence. Lucas's old record was formally cleared, the false blame erased from federal files, allowing him to finally set down the nickname Ghost without needing to hide behind it any longer than he wanted to. During a quiet internal gathering, Evelyn stood before her employees and openly thanked Lucas for saving her life and, in many ways, saving the company itself from forces it never knew it harbored within its own walls. Applause filled the room longer than either of them expected, and for once Lucas let it happen instead of slipping quietly toward the nearest exit the way he once would have. Lucas, uncomfortable beneath sudden attention, remained in the room this time instead of retreating into the background, as he once would have done without thinking twice. Later that evening, the two of them returned, almost instinctively, to the same underground garage where everything between them had first been tested and nearly lost. The space that had once held nothing but fear now felt strangely calm beneath the soft hum of working lights and quiet, steady ventilation overhead. Evelyn asked him, finally, why he had chosen to stand and fight that night, instead of disappearing the way his training and instincts must have urged him to do under such pressure. Lucas considered the question for a long moment before answering simply that some people deserved saving long before they ever learned how to save themselves or even understood they needed saving at all. Evelyn smiled softly, understanding now that the man she had once dismissed as ordinary had quietly become the steadiest presence in her life, more dependable than anyone she had ever trusted before him. Neither of them needed to define exactly what came next, content instead to simply stand together in a place that no longer felt like danger but something closer to peace. Lucas was no longer only a driver, and Evelyn was no longer only a title, and together they stepped toward a future built, for the first time, on something neither of them had fully trusted before: each other, and the quiet certainty that some people are worth staying for. Above them, the city went on exactly as it always had, indifferent and bright, while two people who had once been strangers in a moving car stood quietly together in the dark, finally unafraid of it. Some battles are won with weapons, and others are won simply by choosing to stay when leaving would have been far easier, a quiet kind of courage worth carrying with you long after the story ends.